Well, hello, I'm Dr. Tim Hogan, and this is week one of the massive open online course on being a Church of Mercy. And today we want to look at what it looks like to be a merciful church for families. Now, most of us do a lot of work with families, and we know that families have changed a lot over time, and so there are some real challenges for us. As I have been reading The Face of Mercy over the last few months, I've actually been struck by two different feelings that have been pretty strong. The first is, of course, a feeling of real excitement. I don't know what your sense for this has been, but my experience of reading this document has been such a space of inspiration, knowing the way Pope Francis is like just raiding the world with God's mercy. And he's reminding us that we tend to gravitate back toward kind of a religious law, but God always comes back to us with his trump card, which is mercy. And so in one way, I'm really excited by this document and really excited about the impact it could have on families that we work with. And then I've also had some sense of struggle or challenge about what does this look like practically? And one of the ways that I've been thinking about it is, how do we get mercy into the bones of family life? And so that's really what today is going to be about, how we get mercy into the bones of family life. So as we think about these families that we want to get mercy into their bones, like what do they look like? And today I want to address two different situations in families that as I travel around and talk with people who do ministry, these seem to be the two toughest and pretty common families we work with. And the first group of families I would just call the postmodern, overscheduled, super busy family. You know what I'm talking about? Like just about everyone at our parish, everywhere I go, this is the big challenge, right? People have so much on their plate, so much going on. They don't have family meals together like they used to. They don't have quiet Sundays like they used to. So what does it look like for them, for us to bring the face of mercy and be a church of mercy for them? That's the first kind. There's a second kind of family, and those are families that are really broken. And those may be families that have someone with an addiction or someone who really did something bad and it's not been forgiven or addressed yet. And what they need is something quite serious. They need some kind of serious input of mercy. I think of a woman who is apparently homeless who begs for money outside of our counseling center every day. We're in a kind of rough neighborhood in Detroit, and there are people around with drug addictions who beg for money. And I think about her family. Her name is Marky. I think about how her family deals with her. So every day she's got another really sad story about why she needs money. So, every day I spend time with her, talking with her, but she always asks for money, and I always say no. But the question is, so what does mercy look like with her? Is that really mercy? So those are the two things I want to address. Now here's what the balance of our time is going to look like. There's a few different moves we're going to make today. The first is, I want to look at what mercy is like interpersonally between people. As I'm reading this document, I was, getting excited on the one hand, but then on the other hand, I'm thinking, if we just go out and start doing nice things for people, or if I just start giving money to Marky, or I just reach out to my addict family member and say, okay, everything's fine, is that really mercy? And it didn't feel exactly right. So the first thing we're going to do is understand really what does mercy look like on an interpersonal level between two people. And I'm going to borrow from the work I do in a field called interpersonal neurobiology, which really gets at the energy that gets exchanged between people. And what does it look like when we begin to exchange that kind of energy with one another? And then after that, I'm going to look at these two different situations, how we then reach out to families that are busy and how we reach out to families that have real brokenness in them. One last thing, kind of as we launch here. I want this to be helpful for us as we work with families in our ministry, for sure. I also want us to be thinking about how this applies to our own family. And so you might want to be thinking about, as we begin here, how's it going for your family? And do you have any dreams for your family, either your family of origin or the family you're currently in? And maybe asking God, where could we use some mercy there? So what we talk about here won't just benefit us professionally. The hope is it's also going to benefit us personally as we become families filled with mercy at home. Okay, so let's jump right in and see how we're going to do this. Before we talk about how we get mercy into the bones of families wherever they are, we really need to do like a understand the foundation of how mercy gets exchanged. Now, remember, mercy is when you experience an authentic sense of love, even though you don't deserve it. So, how does that happen in real life? Well, here's a picture of this. So, when my daughter was young, my daughter Megan was just a couple years old, we used to go for a walk to get ice cream all the time. Now, Megan, who is a lot like me, at that time in her life, had a hard time sometimes focusing and all that. So that whole summer, she would spend a lot of time tripping and falling, skinning her knees. It was a rough summer. I mean, she had scabs like all over her face, like on her knees and arms, and she even had a scab on her nose for a period of time. So, so we would go for this walk, and here's how it would go down. We'd walk, she would trip, fall, crash, just smash into the pavement. It was nasty, start bleeding, and she would begin to panic, and we would pick her up and hold her really close, and we'd kind of rock her back and forth. And, we'd say, oh, it's okay, little pumpkin, we're right here. Oh, it burns, we know it burns. And then she'd be like, and all panicky and stuff. And then eventually, she would kind of wiggle a little bit, and she'd be all set, so we could put her back down. Now, of course, when we put her back down, our clothes would be filled with we have mud and snot and all kinds of nastiness all over. But she would be fine. Now, the question is, what happened between us and Megan every time we had that kind of interaction? And so what the interpersonal neurobiologists are telling us is that what actually happens between people when they're in a relationship is there is an actual and real exchange of energy that goes on between the two of them. So what was actually happening with Megan and me and with my wife when it was her turn was we would, that her pain, the pain that she felt inside of her, would actually transfer to my heart. And so I would actually be absorbing her real pain, and she would be actually absorbing of the real comfort, like the kind of what we would be giving her. So she would be taking in our comfort, and we'd be taking in her pain. And here's the cool thing. Here's how we learned how powerful that was. So it's now 4 or 5 months later here in Detroit, where it's really cold, wintertime. We're all in the family room, and we hear in the other room, we hear this doll, this baby, start crying. I don't know if you had one of those. These are those dolls that at random times would just start going, and you'd have to go and you'd have to pick it up and you'd have to kind of rock it and stuff. And if you did, then it would calm down. Although, as an aside, if you have one of those, I found that you can just pick it up and just shake it really hard, real quick, and then it stops crying. So that works too. But my wife didn't let me do that when kids were around. But in any case, so we were in the family room. We hear this baby crying, and we go to get it. And all of a sudden, Megan pops up and says, "No, Megan do, Megan do." So Megan runs to the other room, and we hear her little voice in the other room saying, "It's okay, little pumpkin. Megan's here." And so as we were in the other room, it became clear to us that Megan had actually taken our mercy for her over the summer. She had taken our love for her really into her bones, really into her body. It was as if she now had our voice of love and mercy deep inside of her. And so that's really what we want to do with today's family. So the question is, how do we do that? What does it take to be that mercy for the people we work with so that they can take a real energy of mercy with us? So that they don't just take away this idea that this is the year to start doing nice, merciful things without that true, loving, and merciful connection. And it turns out there's a few things that need to happen in order for us to exchange mercy. And you actually find this in Pope Francis's document. He's constantly encouraging us to have authentic and real engagement with the people we're serving, and engaging them in a way that creates a great sense of openness for them to be who they are. He reminded us in Joy of the Gospel to know that we're on sacred ground and to let them be who they are. And one of the things that produces, I think, is a thing that we like to call resonance. And resonance means when our head is clear and we're relaxed and calm, we're with someone and we're able to let them be where they are. And that allows them, their emotions, to come to us, where we can observe and experience their emotions in a very relaxed way. So how do we do that? How do we become people who invite that sense of resonance with the people we serve? And there's a few different ways of doing that, but in a real basic way, it strikes me that if we are a people who really ground everything we do in prayer, and so what that might mean is as simple as as you're preparing for a meeting with families or preparing to be with your people at church, to ensure that you've taken the time to pray and settle your mind down. There's a mind state that's called mindfulness that you're probably well familiar with. And when people are in that state of mindfulness, they find that creating resonance with the other person in front of them becomes much easier. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I just think is fascinating is how we become people who experience empathy with one another. Now, if I took this piece of lemon I have here, quite interesting. So if I had this, it's a piece of lemon, it really is. And if I put this in my mouth and kind of suck on it here while I'm recording this, I wonder if you had any response to that. Odds are good, at least some of you had kind of your own mouth kind of watered a little bit. And the question is, why would you do that? And why does that happen to people? Or if you're watching someone and they pick up a lemon and they take a bite, why does your mouth water when they take a bite? And the answer comes from interpersonal neurobiology, and what it says is, we actually are constantly exchanging energy and information. And so what that means is, which is sort of exciting to me, that when we talk about being the body of Christ, we don't just say that as a metaphor. We really are. We are really connected. There's an energy that connects all of us. Now that gives me hope, because as we talk about, cultivating mercy for families and being a church of mercy for families, not just an outside church, but actually being in families so that they can become families of mercy, so that as the domestic church, mercy can be really growing in families. I think that's made possible in a very real way by the energetic connections that we create. Okay, so what I want to do next is suggest what I think is a really necessary kind of 3-stage process of getting mercy back into the bones of family life, whether or not it's because people are just too busy or whether they have some real serious brokenness that they need to deal with. All right? So the first step of becoming a family of mercy and getting mercy back into the bones of family is really learning how to release bitterness and resentment. A lot of people carry around some bitterness and resentment. As I work with people in ministry around the country, it's really hard to work with families that say they want their kid to get confirmed, right? And then they come to one of the 10 prep sessions, but then expect the kid to be confirmed or whatever. So what happens to us over time dealing with super busy families, not to mention families that have really serious brokenness? Well, the first thing that happens is I think our hearts begin to harden. And so when we ask the question, what does it look like to be merciful to these families? It's not an easy thing. So step one is we release bitterness and resentment. How do we do that? The first step for people is we got to name the pain. We got to name what hurts. Maybe journal about it. And as I suggest here, what hurts about this is, or what makes this difficult in my job is, or what really let me down about this with my family is. That's step one, until we're honest about how we are hurting from it. And we may have some bitterness towards God as well. That is an important thing to address in this process. Then the second thing is, as Pope Francis says in the Face of Mercy, we need to rehumanize the person. We need to release judgment. And the way we do that is to allow ourselves to see them in a more human way, with some more positivity, maybe by looking at their story and understanding why they are the way they are. One of the things that I talk a lot about, which I didn't in this training, is just how busy families are and how much pressure they feel. And maybe part of what we need to do is to get reacquainted again with what makes people kind of so miserable to be around. One of my favorite sayings with working with difficult people is, if it's that hard to be around them, imagine what it must be like to be them, right? So to rehumanize people and even reconnect with what is difficult about their life is the second thing. And then the third thing, when it comes to releasing this bitterness and resentment, is to really meditate on Jesus. As Pope Francis says, he is the face of the Father's mercy, and he manifests power through his forgiveness and mercy. So I have developed a series of meditations. One of them is on releasing resentment. And this is a real key to the process of releasing resentment. which is to be able to identify with the face of Jesus. And by the way, those meditations, you can get them free on Spotify if you want to. You can also download them on iTunes, but they're free on Spotify. And as we do this, as we seek God's face and look to release our resentment and bitterness, I think it's helpful to see this as an expression of strength. You know, one of the things that struck me about the face of mercy is how Francis talks about this in paragraph 6 as an expression of God's omnipotence, not God's weakness, that he is merciful. And I think of the word meekness and what it means to be authentically meek. And that word, as you may know, comes from the process of back in the day when they used to train horses, and they would train these big horses, and they would, it was called meeking the horse. So taking a horse that was super powerful, but training it to direct its power in a certain direction. And I think that's what we're doing when we're in this first step of releasing bitterness and resentment. So that's the first thing we need to do, is release bitterness and resentment. And then the second thing we need to do, which is a general kind of thing, is to invite restoration in relationships. If we try and invite restoration before we've released resentment, it never goes well. But once we release bitterness and resentment, then we're able to invite restoration, which Pope Francis calls a new kind of justice. And what does that mean? This is throughout the face of mercy, but there are a few quotes I'm putting on the screen now for you. The first is in paragraph 20, where Francis says, Jesus speaks several times of the importance of faith over and above the observance of the law. And one can see why. Jesus was rejected by the Pharisees and the other teachers of the law. In an attempt to remain faithful to the law, they merely placed burdens on the shoulders of others and undermined the Father's mercy. And what he's saying, and he says this in many places in the document, is there tends to be, in our lives, this movement. We always seem to go back to law and go back to a sense of justice and make that the basis for our lives, rather than coming around and making mercy the basis of our lives. You can also see in these other wonderful quotes from paragraphs 20 and 21, finally, Francis said, God goes beyond justice with his mercy and forgiveness. Yet this does not mean that justice should be devalued or rendered superfluous. On the contrary, anyone who makes a mistake must pay the price. However, this is just the beginning. So what is Francis saying? He's saying, look, the trump card is mercy. We're always moving with mercy. Release bitterness, move in mercy, invite restoration. It doesn't mean we don't think about consequences or don't in any way invite people to have some kind of consequences. The difference, and this is the big difference, is, as it says in paragraph 20, this justice is always restorative justice, and it always involves healthy boundaries. So step 1, release resentment. Step 2, work on restoring boundaries. Step 3 is to lean into a season of trust building. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say you are working with your own family of origin and you reach out during this year of mercy and you engage a family member and things begin to be going well. You're able to do some restoration. We need to remember that healing in families happens in a process. It's usually 3 steps forward, 1 or 2 steps back, a little forward, a little back. And so during this year, when we are looking to invite and experience more mercy in our family life, we can go through this process and then know it's going to get better, but know too that it will always take a season before relationships are fully restored. And so that's kind of a general approach to this. Now I would like to suggest to you some real practical things we can be doing for families to be a church of mercy for families. So let's talk about how we bring mercy to a lot of the families we work with that are super busy and sometimes strike us as a little indifferent, but the main thing is they're under a lot of pressure and they tend to be super busy. How do we engage them? Sometimes one of the biggest challenges we have is these are families who have a hard time making it to meetings, have a hard time showing up when it's time for them to be there, for us to reach out to them. So as I interact with people, the people that I get to serve in ministry, one of the things that we have found is that sometimes being a church of mercy for families like that means we end up leaving what's comfortable and we go out and engage them where they are. So something as simple as I know some parishes that I've worked with have decided to ask people who work with youth or families for at least a season to make Saturday and Sunday work days and then to take days off during the week. And what that means is they're there, because a lot of these families do make it to Mass at least a few times a month. And so what would it be like if, when these families do show up for Mass, to have the full staff there to engage and invite, and even just to ask, hey, how you doing? How can I pray for you? I had a close friend who's a real, who was Catholic, and then he became part of an evangelical church, one of these growing churches that's really seems to be really making a difference in people's lives. And it was interesting when I visited that church with him. The minute I walked in the door, everyone, the whole staff was there to greet him, to greet me, to tell me, oh, I think we've heard about you. It was one of those situations where you realize what it could look like as when a church is there and reaching out to people and being God's mercy to those kind of people. The other thing I think we can do for families is sometimes families really need guidance about how they can become the domestic church and how they can become a place of mercy. Remember, mercy is experienced in a very real way when we know how to connect with each other. Kind of like I explained with the example of my daughter Megan when she would skin her knee as a child. Now, families are so busy that they really need us to coach them how to do this. So let me just leave this slide on the screen and give you several ways we can do this. The first thing families can do to become a domestic church and be filled with mercy is when they maximize these transition times, which are any times people are moving from one thing to another. For example, like waking up in the morning, coming home from school in the afternoon, or the transition to bedtime. For example, I coach parents to wake up in the morning like 10 minutes early, get some coffee, have some time to pray and kind of get grounded and establish some mindfulness. Then wake up with their kids slowly, kind of rubbing their back, praying quietly, reminding them of God's mercy for them. Similar special attention can be given after school and in the evenings. And finally, I always say that every time we come home, like reunite or leave, we should make eye contact, tell our kids we love them, and as Pope Francis suggested in his closing Mass in Philadelphia, we can also make the sign of the cross on the forehead of our kids. The last thing that I suggest to families as a way of embracing this year of mercy is to think about the possibility of creating rituals. Families used to have meals together all the time, and families don't really have meals like they once did. And so to talk to parents, how can you create rituals where the family comes together, there's a beginning, there's not a lot of interruptions, and then there's an ending. Meals are a great way to do that. So my favorite ritual is something we call special times and dates. With this, parents can be encouraged to create this one-on-one time with their children and teens. When parents do this, it really is a game changer. Now you can read about it at my website, drtimhogan.com. Just look under free resources and the article called How to Improve Your Relationship with Your Child. There are also lots of resources on creating family rituals at the RCL Benziger website, both where I've written blogs and also resources in the Family Life series, which I helped to create a few years ago. All this is free and it's all available to you. Those are all ways that we can bring a very real exchange of energy, a merciful exchange of love in families. So that's for good for all families. What about for families that feel alienated? There are families that aren't coming close to church or people that aren't coming close to church in our families because they feel alienated by church teaching. As I've been reading everything I can find by Pope Francis, he has said some incredible things. And so just to review, if we're working with a family where people are alienated, how do we lead? How do we engage them? Well, we engage them with mercy, right? We become a merciful church to families, even families that have stopped coming to church or whatever. So what's the best way to approach these families? Well, I stumbled upon this quote here from a book written about Pope Francis. In it, Pope Francis reminds us to approach people with an authentic, humble, and merciful heart. And here's what he said. When you wish to know what our Holy Mother Church believes, turn to the Magisterium, for it has the charge of teaching what we believe without error. But if you wish to know what the Church believes, turn to the faithful people of God. Our people possess a soul, and since we can speak of the soul of a people, we can likewise speak of a hermeneutic, a way of seeing reality, a consciousness of one's own dignity. a conscience formed through meaningful experience and not simply as the product of a theory, from a life that is, at its root, Christian. Now, here's what I take from this. People are really taking their best shot to live a good and holy life. They're doing their best. And so we can be the face of mercy for them and welcome them into our homes and churches before they work out all the details of their faith and belief. I think this is one way we become the face of mercy for these families who feel alienated. So, busy families, families that are alienated by church teachings, and then the last group of families I'd like to address here is what some people call the prodigals. You know, the families like the family of Markey, who is really outside the church and actively going in a different direction. And just a few things that I think are helpful. You know, if the question is, how do we become a church of mercy to families with prodigals, people who really are away from God and don't seem to be coming back? A few things. The first is we just can't give up, right? We need to keep pursuing with a gracious heart, seeking understanding, getting really clear about our boundaries. And so what that means is, like we said before, start by releasing resentment, whether it's a family member or it's someone that we are going to reach out to in our ministry. We release resentment on the one hand, and then we think through what kind of boundaries allow us to still be super loving, but don't allow us to, don't have us enabling. So there's a colleague of mine who had a son who was a true prodigal. He struggled with drugs and the wrong friends, and they tried everything. They tried, you know, tough love, soft love. They tried all kinds of different things for him, and he eventually nothing worked, continued to use drugs. Eventually they set boundaries. He had to move out of the house. That went on for a long time, and then one day, my friend, actually it was at night, he was middle of the night, about 2 a.m, he got a call from the local sheriff, and the local sheriff said, we have your son here in jail, and he said to call you. So this friend of mine had been praying all along, and he said, yeah, he really sensed God was in this, so he got his clothes on, went to the jail. But when he got there, he found like his son had been bailed out already, and he wasn't there at all. So he didn't know what to do, so he went to the last house that he knew his son had lived at. And when he got there, the screen door was there open, and he looked in and saw his son on the couch. And so he walked into the room and kind of stood over his son, and he kind of laid hands on his son and just prayed for him. His son looked like he was sound asleep, and so he just kind of quietly prayed and wept over the plight of what was happening with his son. And then he just left. He didn't wake up his son or anything. About 6 months later, there was a knock at my friend's door, and he opened the door, and there was his son, now clean cut and looking good. And his son told him, he said, you know, Dad, when you came to my house 6 months ago, I wasn't sleeping. And when you left, I told myself, I want to worship his God. That was the first day his son got clean. Started going to AA, and to this day, his son is clean and sober. And I think that's just a great picture of what mercy looks like sometimes. You know, we do this combination of loving well, but setting boundaries. And so for the prodigals in our life, they know we love them. They also know that they can't cross the wrong boundaries with us. So what are we saying with all this? What does it mean to be a merciful church for families? What I've tried to say today is that it is being a merciful church for families begins with understanding what is the actual energy exchange of mercy when we're with people. And I kind of told you that story of my daughter and I as a way of illustrating that, you know, mercy isn't just doing nice things for people or just saying we forgive people. It actually involves an exchange of love. So people experience what mercy is, which is essentially I experience this loving kindness, this graciousness, this goodness, even when I don't deserve it, especially when I don't deserve it. So then I said, so how do we do that? How do we do that with families today? And I said, well, the first thing is we got to understand these 3 stages. The first stage is no matter what, this is a year for us to release bitterness and resentment in all of our relationships. We can always do that. The second thing we can do that Francis encourages us to do is invite restoration. Once we are good at letting go of some resentments and that, and our hearts are getting soft and open, then we can engage in a process of restoration with people, which involves re-envisioning who they are. setting boundaries, engaging them in loving interactions. It might mean some consequences, some amends need to be made along the way. That's okay. And then the third stage, which I didn't talk much about, is being willing to lean into a season of recovery. There may be a lot of mercy this year, but recovery may go on for far more than that. And then the question is, what does that look like? And I think it looks different based on what your situation is like in your own family of origin. You might be doing something different based on whether the challenges you have to do with just a lot of busyness and falling away from relationship, which is kind of the plague of our culture, or whether there's some true problems, some true sin, there's some real prodigals in your life that we need to actually go out and pursue. Last picture of what mercy could look like for a church. I did a marriage enrichment program a couple years ago at a church. Got to the end of it, and a couple came up to me and said, this is great, but everything you said about marriage, we know, we've experienced that. Our heart is breaking because we have friends who are, friends of ours are on the verge of divorce, and they both have already started new relationships. Their kids are hurting. Their kids went to school together and all that. And they said, what do we do? And I said, I don't know, but what do they drink? And they said they drink Bud Light. And I said, well, then why don't you go get a 6-pack of Bud Light and head over to their house tonight? And why don't you tell them that you love them, you love not just them, you love their marriage, you love their kids, and you would do whatever it would take to help them reconcile, including watch their kids for a weekend while they went away on a marriage enrichment weekend. So they left the conference. I packed up, went home, didn't hear anything. A few months later, 3-4 months later, I get a new couple in my office. And they walk in, they're kind of holding hands. They look like they like each other, which isn't real common for the couples I work with. And I said, hey, what's going on? And they said, yeah, so about 3.5 months ago, we were just sitting at home late at night. The divorce was going to be final in a couple weeks. And who walks in but good friends of ours with a 6-pack of Bud Light? And they just told us how much they loved us and how much they loved our family and our marriage and how sad they were that it was dying. And that changed everything. And so we went on a weekend and they watched our kids, and it really ended up being a real rescue of mercy for this family. So that is my dream for us during this great year of mercy, that we can be people both within our own families, our families of origin, and as we engage the families who come to us as church, that we are the face of the Father's mercy for people, and that we are bringing that in a very real, energetic way in our interactions with them, and that we are coaching them how to do that in a day-to-day basis, whether it's because they're busy or because they have some alienating thing going on with the church, or because they're true prodigals and have turned their back. Wherever they are, may this be the year that we are people who bring God's mercy to families. So I want to thank you so much for being a part of this online course, and I would just like to close by praying for all of us who are doing this. And we do pray, our God, that your Spirit would guide us in this year of mercy, that you would give us eyes to go after those lost sheep, regardless of who they are, that we'd cleanse ourselves of resentment, that we would embrace them for restoration, and that in every way people would look at us and see your face of mercy. We pray all this through Christ the Lord. Amen. Thanks a lot.